So there's a lot of talk right now about Antoine Dupont being the best player of the modern era. You could argue that Gareth Edwards was the best player of the amateur era, both of course being scrum halves. But if you ask the subject of this video, he would probably tell you that he is the best player of every era. A man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. He's won multiple Grand Slams, is a test match lion, played for many clubs in many countries and ended his career as Wales's most capped scrum half, and that is of course the legend that is Mike Phillips. Phillips throughout his career had so many big moments in big games for different teams that he played for, but especially for Wales. Since I first saw him trot onto the grass at the Arms Park, I've always had an affinity for his aggressive play style and his abrasive personality. He has of course had some ups and downs throughout his career like many players do, but like all the great ones he always bounced back to prove the doubters wrong, and this is the story of his career. Mike grew up on the family farm in Bankerville in Carmarthenshire. Bankerville is actually a fascinating place in itself. With a population of only roughly 300 people, it's not only produced British lions like Phillips, John Fox Davis and Delmy Thomas, but there's also plenty of boxing champions and gold medal athletes that have hailed from this small village. Mike played for a couple of teams when he was in junior rugby, but in his youth he played for Whitland RFC, and that's when his rugby talents started to get noticed. It didn't take long for Llanelli to hear about this young scrum half, and he quickly got called up into the Llanelli's under-21s. Around the age of 19 then, he established himself in the under-21s and had a call-up for Wales Sevens team, which he really enjoyed. The following season, he was invited to train in the pre-season with the senior squad, and this was a big moment for him being a childhood Llanelli fan. Also, there was a lot of real big characters like Scott Quinnell and Chris Wyatt in the squad, and this was during the era of the early days of professionalism, so playing and training was a lot more rough and ready than it is now, and for a young player to come into that environment and survive took a tough customer. As you can imagine though, Phillips thrived, and he quickly began to get a reputation as one of the hottest young talents in Wales. Literally a few games later, and a call would come through from Wales coach Steve Hansen telling Mike that he was impressed with his performances and asked him to join up with the squad to come on a summer tour to Australia. This must have felt surreal. 6 months ago he was playing for Llanelli under-21s, and now he was about to board a plane to go to Australia to possibly represent his country. It's just mental. There was a few other young players too joining up with the squad, like Gavin Henson and Jonathan Thomas, but this call-up would actually be remembered for another classic, controversial Welsh Rugby moment. So back in 2003, the Welsh Rugby squad were in a bit of a dispute with the union. It basically came down to the players felt they weren't getting paid enough and what they deserved for representing their country, and a bit of a standoff occurred where the team was supposed to be heading to Heathrow to catch a plane to Australia, but instead all of the players decided to meet in Cardiff West Services and refused to leave until the demands had been met, putting the tour and the test series against Australia in jeopardy. Nice to see things have moved on from those type of days. Anyway, unsurprisingly, the union were forced to fold and give the players what they wanted, and they jumped on the bus and headed to Heathrow. But there was one final twist in this tale, as the whole debacle had made the team so late that they actually missed their flight, delaying them for another day and forcing fitness coach Andrew Hoare to take the team on an evening fitness session next to one of the runways in Heathrow. I mean, is this not the most Welsh rugby story you've ever heard? It must have been a real eye-opener for the younger players coming into their first squad, thinking that this was the top level of rugby in Wales and everything would be elite, and then standing around in a car park waiting to see if they were even going to go on tour. Anyway, go on tour they did. Though Phillips didn't play any part in the matchday squads, the experience must have been great and just gave him a taste of what the future could be. After the summer tour, he would get left out of the World Cup squad, which he now admits he was quite relieved at, as at the time he felt like he was not ready and it was all a bit too much too soon, so he was happy to go back and get some time at the Scarlets. Back at club level, Scarlets' number one scrum half Dwayne Peel was of course on the plane to the World Cup, and then this gave Mike the opportunity to get more game time, sharing the scrum half duties with another senior scrum half, Guy Easterby. Scarlets actually had an excellent season and in fact won the league that year, but Mike wanted to be the number one, and with Dwayne Peel at the Scarlets he felt like he was never going to get a fair shake. So with a heavy heart he decided to leave the club he'd supported all his life in search of opportunities to be the number one, number 9. There were 2 clubs vying for his services, the Scarlets' bitter rivals the Ospreys and the capital city Cardiff Blues. The Scarlets were obviously keen for Phillips not to go to the Ospreys, and given the fact that he was already living in Cardiff at the time, the chance to play for the Blues and be the first choice scrum half was too good an opportunity to turn down. During his time at the Blues, he was a menace. He was constantly sniping around the edges, making big line breaks on his own, and was always constantly winding up and getting in opposition's faces. On the national side, by this point, he had also made his debut against Romania in 2003, getting on the score sheet as Wales ended an 11-match losing streak by beating the Minnows. From then on, he was in most national squads, including being a non-playing member of the 2005 Grand Slam winning team. But unfortunately, even though he was ripping up trees at Cardiff, when it came to Wales, he wasn't getting many consistent opportunities. That was mainly because he was still stuck behind his old Scarlets teammate Dwayne Peel, who was a vital cog in the 05 Grand Slam, and Gareth Cooper, who was also a top scrum half in his own right. Even though he wasn't necessarily getting his chance on the international scene, his performances at Cardiff had certainly garnered him a lot of attention. After 2 years at the capital, and with Cardiff seemingly in no rush to give him a second contract, the Ospreys approached him again. At the time, with the financial backing of Mike Cuddy, they were making a point of hoovering up a lot of the top Welsh talent to go along with the other stars that they had already had at the club. The number that was being thrown around was roughly £190,000 a year, plus his signing on bonuses. Now that is a lot of money, and that was a lot of money for the regions at the time. So Mike of course signed on the dotted line, and the following season would be heading off to the Liberty Stadium to compete for the scrum half job with All Black legend Justin Marshall, who was already at the club. As fate would have it, a few weeks after the Ospreys announced that Phillips would be joining them, Cardiff was set to play their Welsh rivals in the 2007 EDF semi-final. I remember this game was quite big at the time, and there was a lot of bragging rights, and both teams were vying to be the number one team in Wales. They even played this game in the Millennium Stadium, and this was well before the time of Judgment Day, so there was a real buzz about this game. Without going too much into the details of the events of the match, the Ospreys largely dominated the game, and Marshall himself had an absolute stormer, getting the Man of the Match award. What most people, myself included, will always remember this game for, though, was the scuffle between the two nines in the tunnel after the game. Before this, there was already a bit of animosity, as the two had come up against each other a few years prior when Marshall was playing for Leeds, and things hadn't been particularly friendly between them. With Marshall now at the Ospreys and Phillips about to join them, things didn't calm down, and if anything, the sledging and the abuse on the field just got worse from both men. After the game, they headed down the tunnel, and everyone has their own version of the story, but some crosswords were said and a little scuffle ensued. Phillips grabbed the former All Black, and the teams had to be separated. According to Phillips, though, once he joined up with the Ospreys, there was no real issue after that. They didn't necessarily get on that much, but given the fact that they were both competing for the same position, there was no real incident between them. Now, 2007 was an important year for Phillips personally, and Welsh Rugby as a whole. Unfortunately, Gareth Jenkins had led Wales to crash out of the World Cup in the group stages, and Warren Gatland had been stated as the new Welsh head coach. And Mike was playing really well at the Ospreys, and there was plenty of success going on at that region. And luckily for him, his physicality and his size was the exact type of player that Gatland and his defence coach Sean Edwards wanted in their scrum half. Now, this wasn't always the case for Mike. Basically throughout his whole career, especially in the early parts, the coaches that he played for constantly told him that he needed to change positions. At 6'3", he was obviously a large man for scrum half, and they felt that this would hinder his ability in the future. Even right up to leaving the Scarlets, they were attempting to play him in the centre. But in Gatland, he found a coach who knew exactly how to use his best attribute, and pretty much instantly made Mike his first choice scrum half. And Mike, to be fair, took the opportunity with both hands. In the first game of the 2008 Six Nations, Wales were heading up to Twickenham and came away with a famous victory, and Phillips himself was integral to the second half comeback that Wales put on. For Burns' try, he played an important part, sucking in two defenders before James Hook did some wizard stuff to put Lee Byrne in the corner. Then Phillips charged down Ian Bolshaw, and in the ensuing chaos, he was the one who ended up going over in the corner with a really excellent finish.
Charged down by Phillips. Oh, it's off for Wales. Good pick up by Jenkins. He did. Martin Williams back to Phillips. Phillips. Wales, have they scored? Back to Simon McDowell in the video.
Yes, they know.
And Wales hold out to win in Twickenham for the first time in about 20 years. A couple of games later against Ireland, though, he didn't have his finest moment, when he got yellow carded for basically dropping a knee onto Marcus Horan's back after Wales had won a penalty and Horan was lying on the ball. Now, don't get me wrong, Horan makes a meal of this because it doesn't really look like Phillips drops with a huge amount of force, but either way, Wales had to manage a tricky 10-minute period, which they did excellently. Fair play to Mike, though, he did make amends pretty quick after that. Now, I can't find the video for this, sorry, but he puts an amazing try-saving tackle in on, I think it was Shane Horan, to stop the big winger from scoring, and I'm convinced that no other scrum half in the world would have made such a dominant tackle to save a try on the try line. And I say that because me and my friends always used to argue who was a better scrum half, Phillips or Peel, and I always used to use this as one of my defining arguments as to why Phillips was a difference maker. Anyway, I digress. Wales went on to win a famous Grand Slam, and from that point on, Phillips was a mainstay in what was an excellent Welsh team. Well, kind of. As I often say on this channel, sport can be a cruel mistress, and literally the following week after Wales won a famous Grand Slam against France in the Millennium Stadium, Phillips went straight back to start for the Ospreys and an EDF semi-final game, and unfortunately which injured his knee, snapping his anterior cruciate ligament, putting him out for 9 months. And I mean, talk about coming down to earth with a bang. And unfortunately for Mike, another incident would also mean him coming down to earth with a bang for real this time. During his injury, Phillips was on a night out with some friends when he got completely blindsided by an individual and knocked unconscious in Cardiff. Apparently, according to him, he'd had a relationship with a girl who he believed was single, but she wasn't. The boyfriend had by chance seen Mike Phillips on a night out and decided to get some revenge. Phillips spent the night in hospital, and the papers were more than happy to run with the story that Mike Phillips got knocked out in Cardiff. Luckily for the said individual, Mike decided he didn't want to press charges and just wanted to move past the incident. Unfortunately, this wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last time Mike got into a bit of bother on a night out. Literally a few weeks after this incident, him and Gavin Henson went out drinking in Cardiff on a match day and ended up into a little bit of trouble. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't have an issue with players letting their hair down. If you're injured, there's no reason for you not to go and enjoy yourself. But drinking in the city centre when Wales are playing is kind of asking for issues. You're going to be surrounded by drunk rugby fans and you're going to get noticed. Thankfully for Mike, by December he finally got back on the pitch and would now have plenty of time to get ready for the 2009 Six Nations. This was an especially important Six Nations season because the following summer the Lions would be touring South Africa, so a big Six Nations was going to be vital to getting on the plane. In 2009, the Six Nations were a funny one for Wales. They of course went in defending champions, and though they lost to France along the way, they headed into the final game against Ireland with a chance to win the title for the second year in a row. The game against Ireland wasn't the most entertaining one, but it is of course always remembered for the ending where Stephen Jones put Wales ahead with a few minutes left, and then Ronan O'Gara dropped the goal to shatter Welsh hearts. I see this as a really funny one for Wales because they were basically one penalty away from winning the championship, but actually ended up finishing 4th in the table, which is just weird to be honest. For Phillips, this Six Nations was a good one, and he played well throughout and was actually named in the team of the tournament, and this really put him forward as a front runner to get on that Lions tour and start the test matches. In camp though, there was tension building with attack coach Rob Howley. Howley was no stranger to strained relationship with some of his players, as I've already discussed in my Lee Byrne video, and him and Mike had quite a tumultuous relationship at times. There's not really one singular incident that has any detail worth talking about, but from what I've gathered in researching this video and others that I've researched, Howley's man management could sometimes be a bit questionable. Apparently he would be fairly harsh and critical of Mike, and often make slightly backhanded comments in front of other players, very similar to what Lee Byrne said in his book. Mike, being Mike though, didn't take it too kindly and would often clap back and explode in frustration, so this made a lot of back and forth happen between the coach and the player. Now, I have no idea why Howley was like this to Phillips. Phillips himself feels like it was because they were both scrum halves and Howley wanted like some superiority over him. It could be the fact that Mike would sometimes get into the back sheets of the newspaper for his exploits off the pitch, and it could be Howley wanting to stamp his authority on him. Either way, his relationship was a source of constant bickering and differing of opinions. This never really bothered Mike though, as he had a really good relationship with Gatland, and Gats was the one who was picking the team. The summer of '09 though would offer some break for Phillips and his issues with Howley, as he was in fact selected in Ian McGeechan's 37-man squad to tour South Africa. Since I've been watching rugby, '09 still ranks as my favourite Lions tour that I've ever watched. The squad was full of characters and they bonded well as a team, and this made the test matches really exciting and a brutal affair. Phillips himself had an excellent tour. He had a man of the match performance against the Sharks and was unsurprisingly named to start in the first test in Durban. The first test didn't really go as the Lions planned though. South Africa went 26-7 ahead, but in fairness the tourists fought back but came up just short, losing 26-21. Phillips himself was instrumental in the fight back. He came up just short on a solo snipe, and it was a good bit of defence from Bakkies Botha that forced him to spill the ball with the goal line at his mercy. But with 75 minutes on the clock, Phillips did eventually score with another trademark snipe to make it a tense finish, but South Africa just had enough to hold out and got the win. So, heading into Loftus for the second test, the Lions knew they needed to step up if they wanted any chance of winning the series. In the first test, the Boks were able to outmuscle the visitors for large parts of the game, and it seems like in the second test, the Lions were intent on bringing another level of physicality. Now this match is crazy, but an amazing game, and I love watching it back. Within the first minute, Schalkberger gets a yellow card for eye gouging Luke Fitzgerald, and how this wasn't a red card is beyond me. He actually got cited for this and received an 8-week ban, but he got cleared of gouging as it was declared not deliberate. Makes no sense to me, but that's what they did. Shortly after that, Phillips was involved in a little bit of a shoving match with Victor Matfield and O'Driscoll, as the Lions intended on showing they would not be bullied. And I love this bit where O'Driscoll shouts, "Bring it on." It just makes me laugh. Class. This game was back and forth with no quarter asked or given from either team. Adam Jones unfortunately had his shoulder dislocated from Bakkies Botha in a clear out, and this was a real nasty injury. I remember watching the Lions Raw documentary afterwards, and they were trying to yank his shoulder out and it was minging. But my favourite moment was the tackle from Brian O'Driscoll on Danny Rousseau. I mean, look at this.
Pierre Spies. Brian O'Driscoll.
Now, O'Driscoll is not the biggest man, and he doesn't make the biggest attempt to wrap his arms, but he's punched well above his weight with this one. I mean, look at this one.
He levels him. Look at that. But that is the sort of hit from one of your players that lifts players. That's brilliant play from O'Driscoll.
This game will always be remembered, though, for the ending. With 79 minutes on the clock and the score poised at 25 apiece, Ronan O'Gara puts a massive up and under, but completely messes up the chase and takes out Fourie du Preez in the air, awarding the Boks a penalty from around the halfway that Mornay Steyn nails and etches his name into rugby folklore forever. I mean, balls of steel, you have to say. This, of course, meant the Lions could not win the series, and going into the third test, the Boks decided to rest some of their players and give some of their squad players an opportunity. For the Lions, Mike retained his spot though, and again had a really good game. The Lions looked comfortable through the majority of this game, and with the series sewn up, it didn't have the same edge as the first two tests did. Having said that, when there was a scuffle to be had, Mike was of course in the middle of it. And the Lions, in fairness, did really make the most of their opportunities and eventually ran out 28-9 winners. Phillips had proven that there was to be no dispute that at this point he was a world-class player and was now one of the best scrum halves in the world. And while we're here, let's just take a second to talk about Mike's skill set. He will always be remembered for his physicality, and to be fair, what other scrum half can do stuff like this? But I think other things get overlooked in his game. His kicking was always pretty accurate, and he often put Wales into strong positions on the field to make the most of their dominant defence. And yeah, his service wasn't the fastest of all the scrum halves in the world, but his ability to take responsibility and manage a game got really top notch, especially in the second half of his career. And let's be honest, when it comes down to shithousery, there was no one better at the time.
Speaks Japanese, you know.
But anyway, back to the main storyline. The Six Nations of 2010 weren't particularly a memorable one. Wales struggled to get any sort of consistent performances, winning only 2 games and finishing 4th in the table. Like many others that come off a Lions tour, Phillips' form understandably took a slight dip, and he only made 2 appearances as Gatland kept chopping and changing at the scrum half position. At the Ospreys, things seemed a bit better. They managed to win the league, putting in an excellent performance to beat Leinster in the final game 17-12 at the RDS. This was a great achievement, but this was kind of the point where the Galacticos era started to slow down. The coffers at the Ospreys weren't as stacked as they were anymore, and some players began to move on, and on a personal level, Mike's relationship with the management began to sour as issues with the length of his contract caused tension for both sides. In the 2011 season, the Six Nations, Mike earned his 50th cap against Ireland in the Millennium Stadium, but this game was remembered for a bit of controversy to do with Mike Phillips' winning try. So for those who are too young to remember, during this game, Sexton kicks the ball out on the full, and with a quick bit of thinking, Matthew Rees takes a quick line out and Phillips runs in from about 50 metres, handing off Tommy Bowe in the process and scoring in the corner. Where the controversy came in was the quick line out had been taken with a different ball to the one that Sexton had kicked out. Of course, that's against the rules because you can only take a quick line out with the same ball that was in play just now. The referees somehow managed to mess this up and the try would stand, meaning Wales just edged out the Irish 19 points to 13. A funny aside to this story, Phillips and Bowe are actually good friends from Bowe's time at the Ospreys, and every year Mike sends him a picture of that handoff when Wales play Ireland, and this year he even made him a birthday cake and sent it to him that had the iced picture on top of the handoff. Top banter. 2011 was a memorable year for Phillips for a few other reasons too. The Ospreys had decided they would release him from his contract and he agreed to sign for French club Bayonne. To celebrate his exciting news, he went out for a few drinks in Cardiff, and unfortunately the night didn't end like he would have expected. You've probably all seen the picture, but there was an incident at McDonald's where Phillips ended up face down on the floor. Now, there is of course always 2 sides to every story, and the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. But according to Mike, he tried to go for a McDonald's after a night of celebrations and the bouncers wouldn't let him in. There were a few cross words exchanged, and then Mike apparently decided to walk away. According to him, while he was walking away, the bouncer jumped on his back and then 2 of them pinned him to the floor. At that point, with many people taking photos of him, all he could do was just wait for the police to turn up. They put him in the back of a van and took him home, and nothing came of it. But for a Welsh international to be getting into scraps in the centre of Cardiff is of course not a good look. Phillips does protest his innocence but does take responsibility to this day and admits that he shouldn't have been out drinking and he definitely shouldn't have been going to McDonald's at that hour. There was a fair bit of fallout and he was suspended by Wales for 2 weeks, which was actually quite significant because this year was the beginning of the World Cup training squad and he thought he might have blown his chances. But in fairness, Gatland had a word with him and just told him to be ready to get stuck in once his suspension was over. Now back in the squad, Phillips headed off to Spala for the notorious World Cup training camps. When the team then arrived at the World Cup, there was a huge amount of confidence, and for most of these players, it was probably the most peak physical they've ever been. The 2011 World Cup was amazing for a Welsh fan. Though they narrowly lost the first game against South Africa, the rest of the tournament they performed excellently. By the time they reached the quarterfinals, the team was purring and comfortably dispatched their Six Nations rivals Ireland 22-11. Phillips was in great form, getting on the score sheet and winning the Man of the Match award. Unfortunately, we all know what happened in the semi-finals against France. I'm not going to go into it here because I've actually covered the whole game in depth on another video if you wanted to check that out. But I will say it still leaves a sour taste in my mouth to this day. So with the World Cup now done, it was off for a new chapter in his new club in France. His time in France was actually interesting. The squad had some good individuals, but were pretty mid-table in the top 14. His first season went okay, but the following two were a gradual decline for the club, sacking multiple managers on the way, and then in 2013, Phillips would be released from the club for misconduct. The club had accused him of being drunk at a video analysis session. Mike has always vehemently denied this though. According to him, it was the end of the season and most of the squad had gone out for a few beers the night before. But once it came to the analysis session, he hadn't been drinking at all. The game they were analysing, Phillips had come off the bench around the hour mark, and when this came up on the video session, he shouted something along the lines of, "I used to be a superstar." All the players laughed and he didn't think anything of it. A couple of days later, he was called into the office and suspended for being drunk at the session. A few days later then, he was sacked, and halfway through the season, he was left without a club. Of course, this is his word against theirs, but to be honest, I think if Mike was actually drunk in this session, he would admit that he was in the wrong, but he's always vehemently denied it. Maybe the club was trying to paint him as some sort of a scapegoat for their poor season, or they just wanted his wages off the books, we'll never know. But heading into that autumn series, he was left without a team, and actually in the Wales matchday programme when he played, he was actually wrote as unattached, which is quite funny. Luckily for Phillips, Racing Metro were having a bit of an injury crisis at the time, and Phillips would sign for the Paris club. During his time there, the club were pretty successful, and he got to partner some world-class outside halves, playing with both Johnny Sexton and Dan Carter, which is about as good as he gets. While Phillips was out in France, he was still the main man at Wales. So going back to the 2012 season, after the World Cup, the big thing was backing up the performance that they had done in the World Cup and hopefully exercising some of the demons of the disappointment of crashing out in the semi-final. The first game against Ireland was a real tense affair, but Phillips marshalled the game superbly and really took control of the 10-minute period where Bradley Davis was yellow carded for this.
Lifted above the horizontal.
Well, he's driving him, and back in the World Cup, that is a red card.
But moving swiftly on, one thing that did happen in this game was one of my favourite George North memories, so I'm just going to show it on here anyway. The other memories I have from this Six Nations was Wales going to Twickenham and beating England on their home patch to that iconic rip and chip from Scott Williams. And then the final game at home to France, they corrected the wrongs of the World Cup semi-final and put the visitors to the sword with a dominant physical performance. After that, though, they went on a losing run, weirdly losing lots of close games, and headed into the following Six Nations in 2013, defending champions, but on a 7-match losing streak. This was also a weird one because it was the current period where Rob Howley was the caretaker coach and Warren Gatland was getting ready to be in charge of the Lions. So after they lost the opening game to Ireland, the pressure was really on the staff and the players because it was now an 8-match winning streak and the head coach was nowhere to be seen. The second game saw them travel to Paris to face France, so things didn't really get any easier. But this one was a real tight affair, and at half-time the scoreline was 3-3. In the second half, Wales showed real character and grit. Mike was actually the catalyst for Wales getting straight into the French as he caught the kick-off and went on a big 50-metre run, completely flattening Freddie Michalak in the process. And thanks to a try in the last 10 minutes from George North and his dad, Wales held on to a dramatic victory. They then backed this victory up with fairly regulation wins against Italy and Scotland and would be meeting their bitter rivals England on Super Saturday to decide who would walk away with this year's Six Nations Championship. England themselves had had a really good competition and were going for a Grand Slam, so to say this was a big game was an understatement. Going into this one, Wales knew they had to win by more than 7 points. Anything less would hand the championship to England on points difference. What followed was one of the best performances that I can ever remember seeing. The home crowd was insane, the national anthems were on another level, and the players completely outclassed their English counterparts and sent them packing back over the Severn Bridge with a 33 margin and defeated them to win back-to-back titles for the first time since 1979.
Down bigger, a little bit of fade on it, beautifully struck.
The consequences of this amazing result was that many Welshmen, including all of the backline bar Dan Biggar that faced England, were named in the Lions squad that followed a few months after. By the way, the fact that Biggar wasn't named in this squad is just a joke, and the fact that Gatland was his head coach at the time just rubs salt into the wound. Anyway, heading to the tour, Phillips was again intended as the first choice scrum half for the Test match series. He was also named in the Lions' first warm-up game against the Barbarians in Hong Kong. I always remember this one for Schalk Brits punching a young Owen Farrell, and these guys were clubmates at the time, so it makes me think that there was a bit more beef going on under the surface. But Mike in this one had an absolute stormer, scoring 2 tries and winning man of the match. Unfortunately, in the act of scoring one of these tries, he did some damage to his knee, and for the rest of the tour was plagued with issues, and he was constantly missing training and ending up on the physio's table. In the few appearances he did have though, he did enough to secure the starting role for the first test. Unfortunately for Mike, the first test didn't go particularly well. He was clearly off the pace, and to be honest, he was outclassed by a brilliant display from Will Genia. The Lions didn't really play that well altogether, to be honest. Luckily for them, they had 2 Welsh wizards who scored great individual tries, but if it were not for some shaky goal kicking from James O'Connor and a Curtly Beale slip with the last kick to win the game, then the Lions could have easily lost that first test. For the second test, Phillips was dropped and told to get himself fit and ready for the third and final test. It turned out that would be the big one, as Australia levelled the series with another nail-biting match that finished 16-15. Phillips was recalled for the third test, but the big talking point was the fact that Brian O'Driscoll had been left out in what was inevitably going to be his last ever Lions match. Gatland returned to what he knew, recalling his Welsh centre partnerships of Roberts and Davis.
Told him this morning, obviously he was disappointed, as anyone is disappointed, but he appreciated the fact that he was spoken to before the announcement, and it's just first time any coach has ever had that decision with him in 15 years of rugby. So
he caught a lot of flack for this from outside of Wales, but ultimately it was the right call. Mike looked a fair bit sharper in this one, but behind the domination of that Lions pack on that day, it was pretty difficult not to, and the Lions went on to win 41-16, which is the most points a Lions test team has ever scored in a test match. And though his body was starting to show signs of letting him down, Mike had now managed to achieve the pinnacle for a British and Irish rugby player, being part of a Lion Test Series winning team. Unfortunately though, same as the last Lions tour, Phillips had a bit of a come down after it. To be fair, he wasn't the only Welsh player, and I think even Gatland suffered from his exploits with the Lions. In the 2014 Six Nations, Wales beat Italy in the opener, but struggled from there on in. Phillips had picked up an injury during an S&C session, and similar to the Lions, this dented his confidence and his ability to play his natural game. He also felt he was losing the confidence of his head coach. Until the Lions tour, he had never been in any doubt of his position in the team and Gatland's opinion of him. But during his Lions injury, Gatland had started to distance from him, and now he was carrying another injury. Gatland was starting to ice him out again, maybe thinking that his run as the best number 9 in Wales was coming to an end. After the first 2 games, Phillips was dropped and Rhys Webb was given the starting jersey. The writing was on the wall now for Mike. Father Time was catching up with him like it does to every single player, and this was the first signs that his Wales career didn't have too much longer to go. Webb did okay, but unfortunately got injured, so Mike returned for the final game, where the men in red dispatched Scotland fairly comfortably. He also kept the job for the summer tour to South Africa, but by 2015, Webb was back and firing and was handed back the starting jersey, and Mike was relegated to cameos at the end of games. By this point, Gatland wasn't speaking to him at all, and the only time Howley spoke to him was to dig him out or chastise him. Mike wasn't even arguing back at this point, because he knew that if you counted his Lions caps, he was only a couple of caps away from 100 international games, which is obviously a big milestone, and he wanted to keep the coaches on side to make sure he hit it. In the 2015 World Cup warm-up camps, Mike did pretty good, and though he found it difficult, he did manage to keep the pace with Webb and Davis, who had far less miles on the clock than him. Phillips did actually get a start in the next game against Ireland in the warm-up game. This got him to 99 international matches, but an understrength side were fairly comfortably beaten at home, and a week later Phillips received an email to say he wouldn't be involved in the World Cup squad. That's a little bit naughty from me. 3 championships, 99 internationals, and they couldn't pull him into a meeting to say thank you for his service to his country. It's not a great look. So Mike resigned to the fact that he would never get his 100th cap. But the sporting gods would intervene, and they would offer one final twist to this story. Unfortunately, Rhys Webb, who had managed to keep hold of the starting jersey, got a serious injury in the last World Cup warm-up game, which ruled him out of the World Cup completely. All of a sudden, Alan Phillips was on the phone calling Mike, asking him if he could join up with the World Cup squad. Of course, Phillips agreed, and he felt for sure he would reach his 100th milestone. Unfortunately, Gatland didn't feel the same sentiment. Wales did well to escape the difficult pool, knocking out England again and going through with Australia.
Top day. Yeah, top day, yeah. Cool.
In the pool matches, there was also games against Fiji and Uruguay, where, to be fair, the head coach could have easily given him 10 minutes at the end of either of those games, just to get him to his 100th cap. But I think this goes on to a larger point of Gatland always trying to make an example that no one is bigger than the team. So many times we've seen him harshly deal with aging players in the squad, and Mike was no different, and to me it all comes down to power and ego. As it were, the chance was gone, and after the World Cup, Mike announced his retirement from international rugby. The following season he joined Sale Sharks on a 1-year contract, and he really enjoyed his time in Manchester. He was actually still playing really well, but his body was just not holding up. And after this contract was ended, he decided to retire. He did have one final flutter on the pitch though, doing a favour for his old teammate Stephen Jones, who was attacking coach under Wayne Pivac at the Scarlets. There was a bit of a depth crisis at scrum half, and Jones had called his old mate out of retirement to do a mini tour over in South Africa. Phillips played 2 games and more minutes than he probably wanted to, but was really pleased to get to represent his boyhood club one last time. But it did confirm that his body was done and his time was over, and now he would ride off into the sunset. What a bloody career. To me, Mike stands out as one of the most fierce competitors the Welsh jersey have seen in the modern era. His desire to be the best drove him to play in a way most of the scrum halves could never match. When you watch back and see him literally hit defenders up in the air and flat onto their back, it really is a sight to behold. Another point that often gets overlooked for me is when it comes to Phillips' try-scoring record for Wales. Now, don't get me wrong, 9 tries in 94 internationals isn't a massive return, but when you look at the importance of the tries he scored, you can see how much of a big game player he was. In 2008, the winning try against England in Twickenham that he charged down the kick for to start it initially. In 2011, that try against Ireland that ultimately was the difference in the scoreline. In 2011 again, the World Cup against Ireland, where he scored in the quarter-finals to help Wales get through and had man of the match. And then the semi-finals, scoring a great solo effort against France in what was, unfortunately due to other reasons, a losing effort. And that's not counting the try for the Lions in the South Africa Test match too. When the chips were down, Phillips was almost always one of the players who stood up. He didn't get the ending to his career he probably deserved, but he is still the most capped scrum half, and in my opinion will go down as one of Wales's greats. Thanks for watching.